Welcome. Pull up a chair, or better yet, pull up your pillow. Tonight, we are going somewhere strange. Not strange in a scary way. Strange in a way that makes you tilt your head slowly and quietly wonder whether the people who came before us were very brave, a little confused, or simply operating on information that turned out to be spectacularly, sometimes radioactively wrong. We are going to spend the night inside the 20th century in America, not the version you know from textbooks or documentaries about great men in suits signing important papers. We are going to the breakfast table, the bathroom cabinet, the fairground, the backyard, and the dance floor. We are going to places where ordinary people lived extraordinary, sometimes baffling and occasionally fatal lives, not because they were reckless, but because the world kept changing faster than anyone had quite planned for, and they were doing their absolute best with whatever knowledge they happened to have that particular Tuesday. Because the 20th century in America was not one century. It was 100 different countries pressed into the same borders and redrawn every decade, changing so fast that what was perfectly normal in 1905 would have looked like science fiction by 1965, and what was fashionable in 1975 would have gotten you laughed out of a room by 1995. People were not stupid. That is an essential thing to carry with you as we move through this story together. They were curious, anxious, hopeful, and working with whatever the current best knowledge happened to be. And the current best knowledge kept changing. They were doing their best. Sometimes their best involved drinking radium water and calling it medicine. Sometimes it involved storing emergency canned goods for a catastrophe that never quite arrived. But their hearts were generally in the right place, even when their decisions were somewhere considerably more peculiar. If you are watching this channel for the first time, welcome. This is our channel, and we are glad you found us. If you have been here before, it is good to have you back. Take a slow breath. Let your jaw unclench. Tonight's subject is the strangest things people did in 20th century America, and there's a great deal of ground to cover. So we're going to move through it nice and easy and let the history drift over you gently, one strange chapter at a time. Before we settle in, if you are enjoying what we do here, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely keeps this project going, and it means more nights exactly like this one. Slow, immersive, and filled with history told at a pace that leaves room to breathe. We would also love to know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Drop your city, your country, your corner of the planet in the comments. It is always a pleasure to read through them and be reminded how many different places share a quiet interest in history told gently at bedtime. Now, dim your lights if you have not already. Let your shoulders drop. Find your most comfortable position and let it hold you. There is nothing you need to do tonight except listen. We are going into the 20th century, and it begins as all the strangest things in history do, with someone being absolutely certain they are right about something they are completely, catastrophically wrong about. Imagine, if you will, that the year is 1923. You live in Pittsburgh. You are a successful amateur golfer, a businessman of some standing, a man who lunches well and sleeps reasonably and has, in general, no major complaint about the current state of his health, until the day a friend recommends a new product that has, the friend says, changed his life entirely. It is called Radithor. It comes in a small brown glass bottle. It costs about $1 per bottle, closer to $16 in today's money, but you can afford it, and what it promises is extraordinary. The label informs you that each bottle contains distilled water combined with carefully measured quantities of genuine radium and mesothorium, two radioactive elements that were, in the 1920s, among the most fashionable substances on Earth. You hold the bottle up to the light from a window. It does not glow exactly, but you know, or you've been told, that something invisible and powerful is moving inside it. You have read in the newspapers about radium, the miracle element discovered by Marie Curie at the turn of the century. You have read that it has mysterious healing properties, that it energizes the blood, that the wealthy and the healthy are drinking it regularly, and they have never felt better. You drink the bottle. It tastes like water. Cold, flat, slightly mineral in the way that well water sometimes is in winter. You feel nothing immediately, but you've been told that is normal. Healing works quietly. What you do not know, because almost no one knows yet, is that radium is one of the most dangerous substances a human being can introduce into their body. It behaves like calcium inside the skeleton, settling into bones and slowly, invisibly, methodically destroying them from the inside out. It causes anemia. It causes tumors. It causes bones to become so fragile, they simply fall apart over time, sometimes along with the soft tissue that has been faithfully holding everything together. The man who became the most famous cautionary tale of the Radiator era was Eben Byers, a Pittsburgh socialite exactly like the one we have been imagining. Byers encountered Radiator in 1927 and began drinking it with great enthusiasm, eventually consuming more than 1,400 bottles over the following 3 years. He drank it for his energy, his vitality, his athletic performance. He felt wonderful for a while, the way a person often does when they have convinced themselves something is genuinely working. By 1931, the Wall Street Journal ran a headline that has never quite been forgotten. The radium water worked fine until his jaw fell off, which is, as headlines go, fairly self-explanatory. Byers had lost roughly 2 inches of height as his skull deteriorated. Large portions of the skull and jaw had dissolved entirely. His arms were riddled with holes where bone had simply ceased to exist. He died in 1932, in a condition that his physicians documented with the slightly stunned language of people encountering something medical textbooks had not yet caught up to. And here's the thing that makes this chapter genuinely remarkable. The Radiator craze was not the fringe. It was not the lunatic edge of 1920s culture. It was the mainstream. Radium was in toothpaste. Radium was in face cream. There were radium health pads, radium chocolates, radium butter, and radium sanitary napkins. One company sold a ceramic pot you could rest your drinking water jug in overnight, so the water would absorb radium as you slept and be properly energized by morning. The pot was called a revigator. The thinking, to be fair, was not entirely irrational given what people understood at the time. Radium glows. It emits energy. Energy seems like the stuff of health. Certain European mineral spring spas have been popular for centuries, and when early 20th century scientists measured the water at some of them, they found it was mildly radioactive. This seemed, briefly, to explain why people have been feeling better at spas for generations. What it actually explained was that mild, brief, incidental contact with barely radioactive mineral water was probably doing very little of anything, and people felt better at spas because they were resting, eating regularly, sleeping well, and breathing cleaner air than their factories or offices provided. But the radium connection had been made. It stuck. And for roughly 2 decades, Americans pursued radioactive wellness with the same cheerful determination with which later generations would pursue cold-pressed juice and ice baths. Radium-laced beauty products sat on shelves in department stores. Physicians prescribed radium treatments in clinics. A man named William Bailey, who had no medical degree but several decades of unshakable confidence, built the Radiator business into a thriving enterprise, marketing it specifically as a cure for impotence. That particular marketing detail tells you, across a full century of distance, essentially everything you need to know about what sells. The radium girls, meanwhile, were experiencing the full consequences of daily intimate contact with the substance. These were factory workers in New Jersey and Illinois who painted clock and watch dials with luminous radium paint, and their supervisors instructed them to keep a fine brush tip by touching it with their lips, a technique known, with almost comic inappropriateness, as lip pointing. The women's teeth cracked. Their jaws disintegrated. Some of them, working late, glowed faintly in the dark of the factory floor, which, if you remove the tragedy from it completely, is actually one of the stranger images a century produced. Their lawsuits against the dial painting companies became landmark cases in labor law, establishing for the first time that employees had the legal right to sue employers for occupational disease. Their suffering eventually changed how the entire country understood workplace safety, corporate accountability, and the assumption that a glowing substance must, by its nature, be improving something. The radium craze faded gradually through the 1930s, like a long, slow exhale, as the evidence mounted and the body counts became impossible to argue with. The revigator disappeared from kitchen counters. The radium face creams were quietly discontinued. The little brown bottles of Radiator stopped showing up in medicine cabinets, replaced by other bottles making other promises. What the radium era really represents, before we leave it behind, is something unmistakably human. The desire to believe that a single substance, purchased and consumed, can fix whatever's going wrong inside you. That desire, as it turns out, did not invent itself in the 1920s. It had a long and impressive history in America already, and the radium craze overlapped almost perfectly with the final glowing years of an earlier tradition, the age of the patent medicine, when the cure for whatever ailed you was sitting right there on a drugstore shelf, labeled beautifully, promising everything and made, in many cases, of things that would today require a law enforcement escort to obtain. You are in a small town in Ohio, somewhere around 1905. The drugstore on Main Street smells of wood polish and something medicinal, camphor maybe or cloves, and the shelves are lined with a bewildering assortment of bottles, boxes, and tins, each one more ambitious than the last. You pick up a small paper packet near the front display. It has a cheerful red label and reads, in clear block letters, cocaine toothache drops, instantaneous cure. Below the name, in smaller print, for sale by all druggists. 49 cents. Suitable for children. You put it back on the shelf because your teeth are fine this morning, and reach instead for a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which you've been meaning to pick up for the baby. The baby has been fussing at night. The pharmacist, a kind-faced man who has been dispensing remedies in this town for 20 years, assures you it is perfectly safe and very effective. He is right about the effective part. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contains morphine. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday in America, circa 1905. The patent medicine era, which ran roughly from the 1870s to the early 1910s before federal regulation arrived and politely ruined everything, was one of the more extraordinary periods in American commercial history. It was a time when the content of a bottle were limited only by the manufacturer's imagination and the federal government's profound lack of interest in asking questions. Bayer, the same company that makes your aspirin today, marketed heroin under the brand name heroin in the 1890s. It was sold as a cough suppressant and promoted as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, a description that has since been revised substantially. The Sears Roebuck catalog of 1902 sold a hypodermic syringe kit, including cocaine and morphine, neatly packaged for $1.50. You could order by mail. It would arrive on your porch. A man in a brown uniform would hand it to you and tip his hat, and you would bring it inside without anyone raising any particular concern. Coca-Cola, in its original formula, contained actual cocaine from the coca leaf. The medical qualities of the drink were central to its early marketing, and physicians recommended it for various ailments with the casual confidence of people who have not yet encountered the word addiction in a clinical context. The cocaine content was removed from the formula in 1903, though the flavor was retained through the use of spent coca leaves, which remain in production process to this day, meaning that every time a person opens a Coca-Cola, they are technically drinking something made from the same plant that produces cocaine, minus the part that does anything chemically interesting. There were cures for cancer sold openly over drugstore counters. There were cures for syphilis, marketed as blood purifiers, that contained mercury, which would in some cases treat the syphilis and in other cases cause the patient to lose their teeth, a trade-off that must have felt complicated to evaluate. There were tonics for female complaints, for weakness, for torpor, for general inadequacy of spirit. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound, marketed specifically to women, was approximately 18% alcohol, roughly equivalent to a glass of dry sherry, and sold as a family-friendly tonic during periods when women drinking alcohol openly was socially discouraged. Mrs. Pinkham's compound essentially allowed women to drink without technically drinking, a service of which a remarkable number of them were, by all accounts, genuinely grateful. Whether Mrs. Pinkham herself understood this dynamic when she developed the formula is a question history has been too polite to press. And then there were the tapeworm pills. Not pills that treated tapeworm infections. Pills that allegedly contained sanitized tapeworm eggs, which you swallow with the intention that the tapeworm would hatch inside your digestive system, consume your excess food, and help you lose weight painlessly. The pills were sold openly. Whether they actually contained tapeworm eggs is a matter of historical debate. Whether any sane regulatory framework would have permitted their sale is not. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, championed by a government chemist named Harvey Wiley, who is one of the underappreciated heroes of American history and deserves significantly more credit than he receives, began chipping away at the patent medicine industry by requiring that labels tell the truth about contents. This sounds like a very modest demand, but in an industry where truth and label were essentially strangers, it was revolutionary. The act did not require medicine to be effective. It simply required that if a bottle said it contained something, it actually had to contain it. This eliminated the most brazen frauds, but left standing a remarkable ecosystem of products that were technically honest and practically useless. Manufacturers adjusted by removing the active substances from their formulas and discovered, with no apparent irony, that customers continued buying them anyway, which is either a testament to the power of habit, the power of branding, or the power of hoping very hard that something is working. But the golden age of the cure-all, the tonic, and the reviver still had one great spectacle left in it before it faded. And that spectacle unfolded in Battle Creek, Michigan, inside an institution that was part hospital, part resort, part laboratory, and entirely the personal vision of one man who believed, with complete and unshakable conviction, with the energy of someone who has never once seriously entertained the possibility of being wrong, that he understood precisely how the human body worked, what it needed, and what it must never, under any circumstances, be allowed to do. His name was John Harvey Kellogg. And before we go further, you should know that he invented cornflakes on purpose, that the purpose was not delicious breakfast cereal, and that the full story is considerably stranger than anything printed on the box. You step out of the train onto the platform in Battle Creek, Michigan, sometime around 1910. The air carries freshly cut grass and something slightly institutional, not quite hospital, not quite hotel, somewhere purposefully between the two. A uniformed attendant is there to meet your car. He smiles in the manner of people who work at medical facilities, with professional warmth and a trace of implied evaluation. You have come to the Battle Creek Sanitarium. You have come because you are tired or your digestion is uncertain, or you are wealthy enough to treat the general experience of being alive as something that can be scientifically optimized with the right supervision, which in 1910 was a fashionable thing to believe. The sanitarium, which its founder, Dr. Kellogg, referred to as the San in correspondence because sanitarium took too long to write and he had things to accomplish, was the most famous health resort in America. Its guests included President William Howard Taft, Henry Ford, Amelia Earhart, John D. Rockefeller, and at various points several members of the Vanderbilt family, which should give you a precise sense of clientele. These were not desperate people. These were people who had every material comfort available to them and had decided to spend their considerable money on something that claimed to be scientific. Dr. Kellogg was, in several genuine ways, ahead of his time. He believed in exercise, fresh air, whole grains, and vegetarian eating decades before these ideas would become mainstream. He was a brilliant surgeon who performed thousands of operations over his long career and developed real medical innovations. He was also, by most accounts, a man who was exhausting to be around, and the sanitarium reflected his personality with architectural fidelity. Kellogg believed, firmly and publicly and in print for decades, that meat caused sexual excitement, and that sexual activity in any form, including within marriage, including entirely privately, was one of the primary causes of disease and degeneration in the human body. He and his wife, Ella, adopted 42 children over the course of their marriage. They slept in separate rooms. This was a feature of the arrangement rather than a flaw. The solution to human biological desire, as far as Kellogg was concerned, was food. Specifically, food so carefully managed, so deliberately bland, so intentionally unexciting that it could nourish the body without in any way provoking it. This was why he developed cornflakes, not because he thought the world needed a convenient breakfast, but because he wanted breakfast to be boring on purpose. The cornflake was not a food product. It was a therapeutic intervention dressed as cereal. Graham crackers, invented a few decades earlier by the Reverend Sylvester Graham, had been developed under a nearly identical philosophy, the belief that bland, roughage-heavy food would quiet the body's more inconvenient impulses. The 19th and early 20th centuries produced, when viewed this way, one of the great eras of deliberately depressing food, a culinary tradition in which the entire point was to make eating as uneventful as possible. At the sanitarium, your day would be precisely scheduled from early morning onward. You would exercise on mechanical devices, Vibrating platforms, mechanical horses designed to simulate the physical movement of riding without the requirement of an actual horse, various electrical and mechanical contraptions that promise to stimulate specific organ systems by shaking, vibrating, or mildly electrifying them. The gymnasium was well equipped. Whether the equipment accomplished what it claimed was a separate question. You would eat in the large dining room, where every item on the menu had been designed by Kellogg to nourish without stimulating, a quality described in surviving letters from one guest as eating wallpaper paste that had developed professional ambitions. The menus were creative, technically speaking, in the way that any strongly constrained creative problem produces creativity. When almost everything is forbidden, what remains becomes inventive. You would drink enormous quantities of water. You would receive multiple enemas. This was standard daily sanitarium practice, and some of these would involve yogurt cultures introduced into the lower digestive tract, because Kellogg believed that the right bacteria in the right locations could profoundly improve health. He was, remarkably, not wrong about this in principle. The specific implementation would raise concerns in contemporary clinical settings, but the underlying instinct about gut bacteria was ahead of its time by roughly a century. You would also be instructed to practice what was called Fletcherizing, not Kellogg's invention, but one he enthusiastically incorporated into the sanitarium program, because it fit perfectly with his philosophy of treating the act of eating as a medical procedure rather than a pleasure. Horace Fletcher was a businessman from San Francisco who, in the 1890s, was refused life insurance because of his weight and general health. The insurance company's assessment stung him considerably. He decided to cure himself through the radical application of an idea he had arrived at through extensive self-experimentation. The key to perfect health was chewing, not just chewing. Systematic, disciplined, meticulous chewing. Each bite of food must be chewed a minimum of 32 times, one for each tooth, and ideally considerably more. 100 chews per bite was not considered excessive for a dense vegetable. Nothing should be swallowed until it had been completely liquefied in the mouth. If you were chewing bread and it became liquid before the required number of chews had been achieved, you continued chewing the liquid in place, counting carefully until the minimum was reached. Fletcher also held that saliva produced independently of food being in the mouth should be expelled rather than swallowed. At the table, in company, he called the system Fletcherizing, and he became famous for practicing and promoting it, which tells you something important about the early 1900s and the low bar at which fame could be achieved. He lost 65 pounds. His health improved markedly, almost certainly because eating so slowly meant he consumed far less food overall, without formally restricting himself. He was invited to demonstrate his method at Yale and at the United States Military Academy, both of which found his results interesting enough to investigate further. His followers included Henry James, Franz Kafka, and John D. Rockefeller, a list that suggests Fletcherism attracted people who were either genuinely philosophical or simply had enough time in their days to chew each bite 100 times, which is itself a form of luxury. At the sanitarium, Fletcherizing was practiced at every meal, in a dining room where the normal sound of a meal, conversation, the clink of cutlery, the occasional laugh, were replaced by the sustained percussive rhythm of dozens of wealthy Americans chewing their food with the focused intensity of professionals at work. Guests were expected to count their chews. Staff would circulate and remind anyone who appeared to be swallowing prematurely. The sanitarium attracted visitors for decades. Its most crowded years were the 1910s and 20s, when the idea of wellness, though the word itself had not yet arrived in the form we know it, first took serious hold among Americans who could afford to pursue it. The idea that the body was a system that could be managed, optimized, and improved through proper inputs and expert oversight was new and exciting. And Battle Creek was where you went to pursue it most seriously. Kellogg's falling out with his brother will over the question of whether to add sugar to cornflakes, thought it would improve sales. John Harvey thought it would contaminate the therapeutic product. Eventually produced two separate legacies. Founded the Kellogg Company. John Harvey continued his project of making breakfast as medically serious as breakfast could be made. The building that housed the sanitarium still stands today in Battle Creek. It now serves as a federal office building. Something about that feels right, though the precise nature of the rightness is difficult to articulate. By the time the 1920s arrived in full, Americans had developed an appetite for wellness, for novelty, for the collective experience of pursuing something that might not entirely make sense, but was certainly exciting to witness. And nowhere was this more public, more peculiar, more unmistakably human than on the floors of dance marathons that spread across the country in those years, filling municipal halls and converted ballrooms with couples who were doing something that technically qualified as dancing in the same way that a person lying very still qualifies as resting. Picture a large hall somewhere in the American Midwest, sometime around 1931. The year matters enormously. In 1931, more than 15 million Americans are out of work. Bread lines stretch around city blocks in every major city. Banks have been failing for 2 years. Families have moved in with relatives. There is a quality to the air in American cities in 1931. A compressed, uncertain, exhausted quality that does not feel entirely safe to breathe too deeply. Into this atmosphere, someone has rented a hall, installed a dance floor, hired a band and promoter, and sold admission to the general public, and invited couples to dance continuously for as long as they possibly can. The rules vary slightly from venue to venue, but the basic structure is consistent. Couples must remain on the floor, moving at all times. Each hour, they receive a short break, 11 minutes, typically, to use the restroom, receive medical attention, eat something, drink something, or simply fold into a chair and stare at the ceiling in a specific way of people whose brains have separated from their bodies and are monitoring proceedings from some small distance. Then the whistle blows, and they must be back on the floor, moving. Moving is a generous word by day 4. What contestants are doing by day forbears only a technical relationship to dancing. Partners sleep on each other's shoulders, one keeping the other nominally upright, while both shuffle in a slow drift across the floor. They sleep standing. They dream while moving. Their feet have passed through several distinct phases of pain by now. The initial blistering of day 1, the numbing of day 2, a deeper, persistent ache that has climbed up to the ankles and installed itself somewhere around mid-shin by day 3, like an unwanted house guest who has decided the accommodations are adequate. You are standing at the edge of the floor tonight, watching. You paid 15 cents to come in, which is not a small sum in 1931. The hall smells of sawdust and sweat and something fried from the concession stand along the back wall, where sandwiches are being made for the contestants on their 11-minute breaks. Music comes from a live band, though the band works in rotations, sleeping between sets. When the musicians rest, a phonograph takes over, playing the same songs in a different order, which makes time feel even more elastic than it already does in here. Dance marathons have begun in the 1920s as novelty events. A couple danced for 20 hours, broke a record, got into the newspaper, and went home to sleep for several days. But in the Depression, they evolved into something else. They became, for the promoters who organized them, a business. For the contestants, they became jobs. The people on that floor tonight are not enthusiastic amateurs. They are professionals, mostly young working-class people who are genuinely, practically desperate, who travel the country from venue to venue, competing for cash prizes ranging from $500 to $1,000, which represents months of income at Depression-era wages. Some married couples enter together. Others are paired by promoters, which creates its own strange intimacy. Spending weeks in sustained physical contact with someone you met 4 days ago, having exchanged perhaps 50 words, learning each other's sleep patterns and small reflexive gestures, and the specific way each person slumps when the last of the evening's energy is gone. The promoters ran their events with the organizational instincts of a circus and the ethical flexibility of a riverboat card game. They created narratives. This couple was a sympathetic underdog pair with a moving backstory. That one was a glamorous duo everyone loved to resent. A third couple were the scrappy local favorites who deserved to win because they were from here, and the crowd should cheer for them specifically. Audiences were encouraged to tip favorites, literally, to walk up to the floor and hand coins to the couples they want to continue. The elimination rounds were where conditions became particularly grim. Periodically throughout the marathon, a sprint race was called. Contestants ran laps around the floor, and the last couple to complete the circuit was eliminated. This meant that people who had been awake and moving for 11 days were required to run on demand or lose any chance of the prize. Photographs from these events capture faces that exist in a particular emotional territory, simultaneously determined and somewhere else entirely, the way people look when their body is moved to a different neighborhood from their mind. Medical staff were technically required to be present. The actual medical credentials of those staff members varied considerably by venue. Some contestants developed serious foot infections from burst blisters that had been danced on for too long. Some had acute nervous breakdowns on the floor, which the promoters occasionally incorporated into the evening's entertainment. A handful died during or shortly after marathons, though promoters were not typically forthcoming about this, for understandable commercial reasons. The audiences kept coming. Night after night. With their 15 and 25 cents, they came. The dance marathon offered something that the movies, for all their glamour, could not. Real people, real suffering, real suspense with genuinely uncertain outcomes. You could walk to the edge of the floor and look directly into a contestant's face and see actual, unperformed exhaustion, actual desperation, actual physical pain. Compared to the managed distance of a cinema screen, the immediacy was startling, and to Depression-era crowds who were themselves living with genuine uncertainty, oddly moving. The marathons faded in the late 1930s as some cities passed ordinances banning them as exploitive spectacles, and as the Depression's worst years receded enough that the appetites they had fed began to diminish. They left behind a peculiar legacy, the demonstration that endurance, suffering, and spectacle, properly packaged and priced, could sustain an audience for weeks, which is a lesson that, if you look at the entertainment landscape of any subsequent decade, Americans have never entirely unlearned. Not far from wherever your dance marathon is happening. In the same years, another kind of endurance was playing out, a quieter, stranger, more privately determined kind. In speakeasies and private clubs, in the back rooms of pharmacies, and in people's bathrooms where large clay jugs sat next to bath towels, Americans were exercising a related form of stubbornness, the deep-seated conviction that if the law told them they could not have something they genuinely wanted, then the law was, in that particular respect, wrong and could be safely ignored. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution went into effect at midnight on the 17th of January, 1920. By 12:01 on the 18th, federal agents in Chicago had already seized a shipment of medicinal whiskey. By 12:02, someone in New York had decided the whole business was going to work out fine and poured themselves a drink anyway. This sequence of events established the basic rhythm of Prohibition that would persist for the next 14 years. Determination from one side, creative noncompliance from the other, and an increasingly elaborate infrastructure developing to support the noncompliance at scale. Prohibition banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. What it could not do, because no amendment to the Constitution has yet been written that can accomplish this, was eliminate the desire for them. The result was one of the more dramatic unintended experiments in American social history. A decade and a half during which a nominally law-abiding nation developed a complete parallel economy, with its own geography, its own currency of favors and connections, its own vocabulary, and its own social customs. You are inside a speakeasy. The year is 1925. The address exists nowhere in writing. You knew to come here because a friend told you, and before that, someone told him, in the whispered network of referral that operates on the same social physics as a very good restaurant recommendation, except that here the recommendation carries a slight legal risk that makes the telling of it more intimate and the place itself more appealing. The door is unmarked. You knock in a pattern. A small window opens, and an eye looks at you. You say a word. The door opens. Inside, the lighting is deliberate, not romantic dim, but strategic dim. Dim enough that if federal agents came in, they would have several uncomfortable seconds of squinting before identifying anyone with confidence. This is, of course, the point. The room smells of cigarette smoke and spilled beer and the faint metallic undertone of a space that has been sealed longer than a room should ideally be sealed. Music comes from somewhere. A piano, probably. The music is louder than it needs to be for a room this size, which is also, of course, the point. What you drink depends entirely on which speakeasy you have found. In major cities, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, the better establishments maintain genuinely excellent quality, importing proper Canadian or European spirits through elaborate smuggling networks that had sprung up on both coasts within months of Prohibition taking effect. Some establishments had wine cellars. Some had stashes of pre-Prohibition whiskey that was legitimately aged and of a quality that would have impressed any serious drinker in any previous decade. In rural areas and lower-income neighborhoods, the available alcohol was far more likely to be homemade, distilled in bathtubs, though bathtub gin is a slightly misleading term, since the bathtub was used for mixing rather than distilling. Raw industrial alcohol tasted exactly as pleasant as its name suggests, and flavoring it with juniper extracts and water produced something that bore a family resemblance to gin in a way that a rough sketch bears a family resemblance to the painting it was made for. And then there is a part of the Prohibition story that is less often told, one that the government created with its own hands. Industrial alcohol, used in manufacturing processes and some medical applications, had been required for years to be denatured, meaning made undrinkable by the addition of noxious substances. During Prohibition, the Treasury Department substantially expanded this program, requiring manufacturers to add increasingly toxic chemicals to industrial alcohol, methanol, which is what alcohol and causes blindness and death, kerosene, benzene, mercury salts. The stated reasoning was that this would prevent bootleggers from redistilling industrial alcohol for sale as drinking spirits. The bootleggers redistilled it anyway. The poisons were not always fully removed. By 1926, New York City health officials were reporting 41 deaths on Christmas Day alone from tainted alcohol. The total deaths attributable to government-poisoned alcohol across the Prohibition years are estimated in the tens of thousands, though the full accounting has never been precise. This was not a secret. Public health officials knew. Newspapers reported it. The government's position, articulated by certain Prohibition enforcement officials who do not read well in the historical record, was that people who chose to purchase illegal alcohol had accepted a certain degree of risk and bore responsibility for the consequences. The official in charge of Prohibition enforcement stated publicly that people who drank bootleg spirits essentially got what they deserved. By the standards of any era, including the one that produced it, that is a difficult position to defend. The creative workarounds that did not involve government-poisoned spirits were numerous and occasionally charming. Physicians could prescribe medicinal whiskey under a Volstead Act exception, and demand for medical alcohol licenses among the nation's doctors increased by roughly 400% almost immediately after Prohibition began. The country was apparently very sick. Synagogues and churches could use wine for religious purposes, and synagogue membership in cities with large Jewish populations increased noticeably during the 1920s, a surge in religiosity that historians have attributed to a combination of sincere faith and a sincere interest in sacramental wine, in proportions that vary by congregation and are difficult to quantify. Home winemaking for personal consumption was technically permitted below a certain volume threshold. California grape growers responded to this exception with the kind of market ingenuity that earned them no small amount of private admiration. They sold grape concentrate in blocks, labeled helpfully with instructions for how to dissolve the concentrate in water and at what temperature to store the liquid. The labels also carried warnings, fine print advisories cautioning the purchaser that if they were to dissolve the concentrate, store at the recommended temperature in an appropriate vessel, the liquid would ferment and become wine, which was of course illegal and which they should therefore not do. The warning, as a practical matter, was functionally indistinguishable from a recipe, and everyone involved understood it as such. Prohibition ended on the 5th of December 1933, when President Roosevelt signed the 21st Amendment and the country collectively exhaled and had a drink. The repeal is often framed as common sense defeating idealism, though the people who built the Prohibition movement were themselves motivated by genuine concern. The very real damage that alcohol abuse caused to working-class families in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was significant, and their frustration was not unreasonable. They simply chose a solution that generated problems on a scale that overwhelmed its benefits. What Prohibition created, alongside all its more colorful cultural history, was a foundation of organized crime in America. The logistics, capital, personnel, and law enforcement relationships required to run a bootlegging operation at scale could only be provided by organization, and the organizations that provided it found themselves, when Prohibition ended, holding infrastructure, relationships, and capital that could be redirected to other enterprises. The machine that Prohibition built had a longer operational life than the law that assembled it, lasting through several generations of the century we are moving through. But all of this, the radium and the tonics and the sanitariums and the dance floors and the speakeasies, existed at the same time in the same decade, alongside something else. Something that wore the clothes of science, spoke the language of progress and improvement, attracted the endorsement of universities and public institutions, and cast a shadow considerably longer and more troubling than anything we have discussed so far. It is a summer Saturday. The year is 1924. You are at the Kansas State Fair, and the smell of fried food and livestock and sun-warmed grasses everywhere. Somewhere a brass band plays something cheerful, and children run past you toward the animal exhibitions, and couples hold paper cones of spun sugar. You pass the sheep building and the cattle building and arrive at a long wooden hall with an official-looking sign. The sign reads, Fitter Family Contest. Inside, your family will be measured and evaluated and scored. Your height, weight, and physical proportions will be assessed by trained nurses. A physician will review your family medical history for what the literature of the day calls defective traits. Depression, epilepsy, intellectual disability, criminal history, alcoholism. Points are assigned. Points are deducted. At the end, the families with the highest scores are awarded bronze medals. The medals read, "Yeah, I have a goodly heritage." A biblical quotation repurposed for the scientific ranking of American farm families, which requires a moment to settle into its full strangeness. The Fitter Family Contest and the related Better Baby contest that judged infants by similar scoring systems were cheerful public expressions of a wide, well-funded, and academically respectable movement called eugenics. The word comes from the Greek for good birth. Its central proposition that human beings could be improved through selective reproduction, and that society had a legitimate interest in encouraging the fit to have children while discouraging or preventing the unfit from doing so, had by the 1920s penetrated American culture at almost every level. Universities offered eugenics courses. Scientific American published favorable articles. Major natural history museums hosted substantial eugenics exhibitions. Over 65,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized under state eugenics laws before the practice was gradually, unevenly wound down. In some states, not until 1970s. The Better Baby contests were, on the surface, more festive. Mothers brought infants, some barely able to sit upright, to be examined by nurses and physicians who scored them on a 100-point system. Points were deducted for specific imperfections. Specific measurements, observed characteristics, family background items that the scoring rubric categorized with clinical language. The deductions for what was termed inferior racial heritage operated in practice to ensure the medals went to a consistent subset of contestants regardless of the individual children's actual health. The whole spectacle stands now as a reminder that the most dangerous nonsense is always the kind that arrives dressed as science, that speaks in technical language, surrounds itself with respectable people, publishes in reputable places, and offers prizes for participation. The Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory on Long Island, funded partly by industrial fortunes and scientific foundations, served for decades as a center of American eugenics research. Its director corresponded regularly with German eugenicists through the 1920s and into the 1930s, providing intellectual support and material that contributed to what became, under the Nazi government, the most consequential application of eugenic theory in human history. The relationship between American and German eugenicists was a comfortable professional one. For a time, after 1945, it became a great deal less comfortable to discuss. The Fitter Family era faded through the 1930s, as the political associations of eugenic theory became increasingly inconvenient. The language changed. The framing shifted. The laws in many states, however, remained on the books. The last legally mandated eugenics-based forced sterilization in the United States occurred in the 1980s. Within the living memory of most people watching this tonight. From a fairground, we move forward. The Depression has arrived. Money is compressed into something much smaller and more precious than it was. And in this atmosphere, in the years between 1929 and 1940, something strange happened to the American appetite for distraction. It became more extreme, more competitive, more spectacularly unnecessary, as if the national anxiety of the Depression years had been compressed into a series of contests and dares and stunts that exist in the historical record primarily as an extended collective question. What on earth were you all thinking? You are on a sidewalk in New York City. The year is 1930. The person above you, roughly 20 feet above you, seated on a narrow platform affixed to the top of a flagpole, is not in distress. He is, in fact, eating a sandwich. He has been up there for approximately 2 weeks and has several more weeks planned. The crowd below him is looking up at the kind of sustained, pleasurable attention previously reserved for things like fires and public buildings being dramatically demolished. His name is Alvin Kelly, known in professional circles as Shipwreck Kelly. He is the most famous flagpole sitter in America, a distinction that makes considerably more sense in the context of the 1920s and 30s than it would in any other period of the country's history. Flagpole sitting had begun in 1924 when Kelly, a former sailor, stuntman, and boxing sparring partner who understood the economics of public attention, had sat atop a flagpole in Hollywood for 13 hours and 47 minutes as a publicity stunt for a theater. The stunt attracted crowds, newspaper coverage, and the attention of other people who thought they could do it too, which is the essential mechanism by which all American fads propagate. Other people tried it. Kelly tried longer ones. The thing escalated in the way that American competitive spectacles consistently do when given sufficient oxygen and press coverage. By 1930, Kelly's duration record stood at 49 days. He sat through rain. He sat through summer heat. His platform was perhaps 18 inches across. With a small horn he could hook his thumbs through while sleeping in 20-minute increments. He ate food hauled up in buckets. He conducted press interviews on the top of the pole by leaning down to speak into a microphone arrangement. He was, by any reasonable professional assessment, very good at his job. Flagpole sitting required no particular physical talent. It required a high tolerance for boredom, a comfortable relationship with heights, and a constitutional ability to manage certain biological necessities at altitude without losing one's dignity entirely. The last of which is a logistical challenge that the histories of flagpole sitting handle with characteristic Victorian discretion. Some cities eventually grew weary of the traffic disruption and the specific sanitation questions involved, and passed ordinances limiting the practice. Kelly adapted, moving to private property and continuing to sit as the crowds continued to gather, and the newspapers continued to run photographs, and the Depression continued to make even a man sitting very still on a stick above a city feel like something worth watching. Kelly died in 1952, destitute and largely forgotten. He is one of history's periodic reminders that fame is a renewable resource for which only the original holder has a sentimental attachment. Flagpole sitting was, at least, a solitary pursuit. The next Great Depression-era fad was collegiate, competitive, and involved a live animal, which raises both the degree of difficulty and the level of questions one might ask about it. On the 9th of March, 1939, a Harvard freshman named Lothrop Whittington Jr. attended a luncheon and, reportedly for a bet of $10, swallowed a live 3-inch goldfish in front of his classmates. He swallowed it whole. The goldfish was, by contemporary accounts, visibly unhappy about this development, though expressed its objection too briefly to have much effect. This would have been merely an unusual lunchtime moment, except that someone wrote about it in the Harvard Crimson. Then someone at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania read the Crimson and swallowed 3 goldfish. Then a student at Boston University consumed 24. Then a student at Clark University attempted 39. Within 3 weeks, the goldfish-swallowing contest was genuinely, demonstrably, nationally newsworthy, tracked in college newspapers with the statistical enthusiasm of a sporting competition, and covered by regular newspapers with a mixture of bafflement and delight they reserve for news too absurd to ignore, but too widespread to dismiss. By April, the record stood at 89 goldfish, set at the University of Illinois. A student in Iowa attempted 101. The Massachusetts Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals issued a statement. The Massachusetts Public Health Commissioner warned about internal parasites. Congress received letters. The letters were varied in their perspectives. The craze lasted approximately 10 weeks before disappearing as completely as a goldfish down someone's throat. No precise cause of death has been identified for the fad, though summer vacation and the natural exhaustion that all spectacles eventually reach when they hit the limits of their own concept are the leading candidates. into the same tradition of young people discovering that doing something profoundly unnecessary together in front of other people had its own peculiar rewards came, in the 1950s, phone booth stuffing, a competition to see how many people could physically fit inside a standard telephone booth simultaneously. The current record at any given institution was immediately challenged by the next institution. Physics placed certain firm limits on the proceedings, but the participants were resourceful about exploiting every available cubic inch, and the photographs from these events capture an impressive concentration of human beings per enclosed volume. Something about the Depression and its aftermath made collective spectacle more necessary, more extreme, and more deliberately pointless. Because if you're going to insist on doing something absurd, you should do it as absurdly as possible. The pointlessness was the point. In a decade where everything felt heavy and consequential and uncertain, the goldfish was a refusal. A small, wet, 3-inch refusal, but a refusal nonetheless. The Depression did pass, slowly and unevenly, through the middle 1930s. The economy gathered itself upward. Then the Second World War arrived and rearranged American life entirely, and the strangest took new forms, quieter, more domestic, more immediately practical. As the country bent itself to the business of keeping the war going while also, as much as possible, staying fed, clothed, and resembling normal, while normal was somewhere else of the duration. Your kitchen in 1943 smells different from your kitchen in 1940. The differences are small but persistent, like tiny pebbles working their way into a shoe over a long walk. The coffee, when you make it, comes out weaker than you like. Coffee is rationed. The butter is scarcer. Fats are rationed. The meat on the counter, when there is meat, is a different cut than you would once have purchased, because the better cuts are traveling to places where they are needed more urgently. You have a ration book. It is a small booklet, filled with stamps that must be surrendered when you buy certain things. Meat, butter, cheese, canned goods, sugar, shoes, gasoline, tires, and various other commodities are allocated to ensure the military gets what it needs without civilian demand collapsing the supply chains that feed it. The ration book is, in the domestic world of wartime America, as important and ever-present as a wallet. People carried them everywhere, registered them to individual family members, and, in the event of loss, entered a specific kind of bureaucratic purgatory trying to replace them. Rationing reshaped the American kitchen in ways that food historians have been documenting ever since, because the recipes that emerged were genuinely inventive, the product of necessity applied to well-developed culinary instincts. Women's magazines ran articles on meatless main courses, on stretching ground beef with oatmeal, on making butter go further by whipping it with liquid, on baking cakes without sugar, cookies without eggs. The resourcefulness was real and considerable. The Victory Garden is the image most closely associated with wartime American domesticity, and it is a genuine image, not a propaganda invention dressed up as grassroots activity. By 1944, approximately 20 million American households maintained some form of vegetable garden, on back lawns and vacant lots, on rooftops, in window boxes and apartments, collectively producing an estimated 8 million tons of food per year, roughly 40% of the country's vegetable supply. These were not decorative gardens. They were working gardens, and they worked. Children participated. Neighbors traded surplus. Community plots appeared in parks where previously only grass had been. The country discovered, in the specific context of wartime necessity, that growing food was both practically rewarding and deeply satisfying in ways that years of purchasing everything at the grocery store had not quite prepared people to expect. Meanwhile, a particular domestic anxiety was unfolding across the country that the official histories of the period tend to address with relative brevity. Nylon stockings, introduced to the public in 1940 and immediately becoming one of the most enthusiastically purchased consumer products in American history, were discontinued for civilian sale in 1941, when the nylon was redirected to military parachutes and other pressing applications. Bare legs, in the social geography of 1940s America, were not considered appropriate in most workplace and formal social settings. The solution, creative, widespread, and entirely characteristic of a country that had developed real improvisational skill under material constraint, was to paint your legs. Women across the country applied foundation or tinted cosmetics to their bare legs to simulate the appearance of stockings, then drew a seam line up the back of each leg with eyebrow pencil to complete the illusion. The seam was essential. Stockings of the era featured a back seam, and a seamless version of the stocking look sent social signals that were, in the 1940s, considered worse than bare legs entirely. Photographs from the period capture the results with documentary matter-of-factness. Women at bus stops, at offices, at social occasions, with their precisely penciled seam lines and their imitation color, presenting as smoothly put together in a way that required considerably more effort than simply pulling on stockings, which was the point of the whole enterprise. When nylon production resumed for civilian use after the war ended in 1945, what followed was one of the most vivid retail events the century produced. Word spread that stockings were back. Women lined up outside department stores before opening. The queues stretched around city blocks. What happened when the doors opened was described in contemporary newspaper accounts with language usually reserved for civil disturbances. Shouting, shoving, windows cracked by the pressure of crowds. Police called to maintain order. A department store in Pittsburgh reportedly sold 13,000 pairs in 3 hours. The nylon riots of autumn 1945 are a footnote in most histories of the post-war period, but they tell you something precisely specific about what 4 years of wanting something and not being able to have it does to people's relationship with restraint when the restraint is suddenly removed. The war ended. The men came home. A great many babies came. A wave so sustained and demographically significant that the people born in those years would carry the name baby boomers for the rest of their lives. And America turned with enormous energy and a quantity of suppressed anxiety that had not quite figured out how to process toward the project of being peaceful and prosperous. The prosperity arrived. The anxiety, as it turned out, traveled with it. You pull into the driveway of your house in Levittown, New York, sometime around 1952. The house is a Cape Cod style. The house next door is a Cape Cod style. The house next to that one is a Cape Cod style. The approximately 15,000 other houses arranged across these former Long Island potato fields are organized in patterns that, from above, look less like a community and more like an architectural diagram of itself. Every house has a picture window. Every lawn is the same distance from the curb. The mailboxes stand in the same position relative to every door. The sameness is not accidental. It is an entire point. William Levitt believed standardization was a key to affordably house working-class Americans. He was correct. By applying assembly line principles to home construction, moving teams of specialized workers from house to house in sequence rather than building each one as an individual project, he drove costs down far enough to make home ownership accessible to families for whom it had previously been theoretical. Between 1947 and 1951, his company built 17,447 homes in Levittown, New York alone. The Levittown covenants also prohibited people of color from living there, which is a fact that sits heavily on any honest accounting of what the post-war suburban dream was and who it was built for. Those restrictions were eventually ruled legally unenforceable, but the patterns of residential segregation they established, reinforced by federal mortgage programs that systematically directed financing toward white home buyers, shaped American geography in ways that persist visibly today. Inside your Levittown house, the kitchen is the room of the decade. The post-war kitchen is a technological showplace. Refrigerator, electric range, toaster, mixer, and a new dishwasher if you're doing particularly well. The refrigerator itself represents a more significant transition than it might appear. It replaced the icebox, which had required the regular visits of the iceman, who was himself part of an entire economic chain reaching back to the ice harvesting industry that had employed thousands cutting lake and river ice each winter, storing it in insulated houses, and deliver it to urban customers through the warm months. All of that, the cutters, the haulers, the storage, the delivery routes, the iceman himself, was replaced by a humming white metal box on a linoleum floor. On the 26th of October, 1953, the Swanson Company introduced a product it called the TV dinner, a complete frozen meal of turkey, cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes, and peas, packaged in a compartmented aluminum tray that could be heated in the oven and eaten while watching television, without requiring a dining table, a tablecloth, silverware, or the performance of a formal evening meal. Swanson sold 10 million TV dinners in the first year. The numbers tell you something the product itself communicates quietly, that eating and paying attention to eating were being decoupled. The meal as the organizing event of the evening, the thing around which a family gathered, at which conversation happened, through which the day was processed, was being repositioned as something you did alongside something else, while paying primary attention to the something else. What is also worth noting about the post-war American kitchen is the nature of the marketing that surrounded it. Magazine advertisements of the 1950s are remarkable documents in their own right. They combine the registers of romance, science, and moral instruction in ways that are difficult to parody because the originals are already operating at the outer edge of what earnest copy can achieve. Household appliances are described in terms of scientific precision. Convenience foods are marketed not merely on time savings, but on a subtle implied anxiety. The suggestion that not using this particular product might mean falling measurably short as a wife, a homemaker, a manager of the domestic sphere. Betty Crocker's portrait appeared on General Mills product packaging throughout the mid-century. Her face was a composite, assembled from photographs of home economists who worked at the company, an idealized domestic authority figure who was, in the most literal sense, built rather than born. She was adjusted periodically over the decades to reflect changing standards of how a trustworthy woman of middle age should appear. She has never existed. And running through all of it, through the picture windows and the aluminum trays and the chrome appliances and the composite portraits on the packaging, there was a background quality to American life in the early 1950s that is difficult to capture precisely because it was both widespread and rarely spoken of directly. Because the Soviet Union had tested a nuclear weapon in 1949. Because both countries now had the capability to reduce each other's cities to ash. Because the morning commute and the TV dinner and the Levittown lawn were all happening in the shadow of a thing that had not gone away, and that people were developing increasingly elaborate strategies for living alongside. The Federal Civil Defense Administration had been established in 1950 to prepare American civilians for the possibility of nuclear attack. Its approach to this task was, in retrospect, one of history's more poignant attempts to apply practical problem solving to a situation that was, at its core, practically incomprehensible. The flagship public communications effort was called Duck and Cover. It was delivered through a short animated film featuring a cartoon turtle named Bert, who demonstrated the appropriate civilian response to the flash of a nuclear weapon. Duck and cover. If you were in school, you dove under your desk and covered the back of your neck with your hands. If you were outside, you fell flat on the ground. If you were near a wall, you used it. If you had a coat, you used it to cover your skin. This was presented with a sincere, reasonable-sounding logic that survivors would exist even in nuclear attack scenarios, and that survival rates improved for people who were not exposed to initial heat flash and flying debris. This was probably true in a narrow, specific set of distance from detonation circumstances. It was not true in the circumstances most likely to produce an actual drill. In the schools of the 1950s, children practiced duck and cover drills with the same regularity as fire drills. Teachers called the signal. 30 small human beings dove under wooden desks. There is something almost unprocessable in this image. The orderly, practiced precision of it. The children with their arms folded across their necks doing exactly what they had been taught in buildings that would have ceased to exist in any scenario close enough to require the drill in the first place. The children ask questions. Children are professionally expert at finding the precise flaw in any adult logic. Teachers answer with the approved language of the period. Some were reassuring in ways that were not entirely honest. Some were honestly frightening. Some were managing their own uncertainty in real time, which was the most understandable response to the available options. The backyard bomb shelter was the other primary expression of nuclear-era domestic anxiety. Popular Mechanics and Popular Science published detailed construction plans throughout the 1950s. The Federal Civil Defense Administration produced pamphlets on equipping a shelter with everything your family would need during and after a nuclear attack. A radio, water for 2 weeks, canned food for 2 weeks, first aid supplies, sanitation supplies, games, and reading material for the children, who would need something to do during the undefined period that would follow. Suburban Americans built them. In 1961, following a particularly concentrated period of Cold War tension, shelter sales increased sharply. Prefabricated concrete units were advertised in mainstream home publications. The decisions involved how large to build, how deep, whether to tell your neighbors, generated their own new ethics, their own previously unconsidered questions. Was it morally right to build a shelter and not share it? Was it right to share it? If your neighbor arrived at the shelter door during an actual attack with his children, what was the correct response? These questions were debated seriously in newspapers, from pulpits, in living rooms. A Catholic priest argued publicly that shooting your neighbor to protect your family's shelter was morally permissible under sufficiently extreme circumstances. The argument was received with a wide range of responses, all of them understandable given the subject matter. The missiles were always there, beneath the cookouts and the TV dinners and the picture windows, a constant background frequency that the 1950s managed by decorating around it. The chrome appliances, the suburban lawns, the certainty of the Levittown ideal, all of it was, among other things, a collective strategy for making the world feel manageable when the deepest truth about it was that it might not be. The decade turned. The 60s arrived with different refusals and different anxieties. Then the 70s came, and if the 50s had been characterized by uncomfortable conformity and the 60s by dramatic rejection of it, the 70s were something else, an era of elaborate, occasionally transcendent, frequently inexplicable self-expression, much of it involving objects that made very little sense, and most of it conducted with a kind of cheerful sincerity that the decade has not always received sufficient credit for. It is the spring of 1975. You are in a gift shop in a shopping mall. The shop sells scented candles and decorative items and cards, and in the front display, on several shelves, there are small cardboard boxes with ventilation holes punched in the sides. Inside each box, resting on a pad of Excelsior hay, is a smooth gray stone. These are pet rocks. Gary Dahl, an advertising man from Los Gatos, California, invented the pet rock in 1975 following a dinner party at which his friends complained extensively about their pets. Pets were expensive. They required feeding. They got sick. They died, and dying caused grief. What if, Dahl suggested aloud, your pet was a rock? It would need none of these things. It would cost nothing to maintain. It would never disappoint you by behaving unexpectedly or requiring a veterinarian. He was joking. And then he was not joking, because the joke turned out to be commercially viable. He sourced smooth gray pebbles from a beach in Rosarito, Mexico. He had them packaged in the small cardboard boxes with hay. He wrote a care manual, a 32-page booklet written with the deadpan composure of a document that knows exactly what it is that explains how to train your rock, to come, to sit, to stay, and to roll over, though this last command was noted as requiring a certain amount of assistance from the owner, how to take it for a walk, and what to do if it ran away. The pet rock sold 1.5 million units during the 1975 holiday season. Gary Dahl became a millionaire. He appeared on The Tonight Show. Newspaper columns examined the pet rock at length, with varying degrees of irony about what it said about consumerism and the American spirit and the fundamental human need to possess things. The columns did not slow sales. The pet rock is the cleanest expression of something the 1970s did repeatedly and deliberately. It embraced the absurd as a legitimate category of experience. The same decade produced mood rings, released around the same period, which changed color based on the temperature of your skin, and came with a chart correlating ring color to emotional state. An aquamarine ring indicated relaxation. A ring cooling toward gray indicated distraction or anxiety. Whether your ring and your emotional state were actually in agreement was a matter between you and the ring maintained professional discretion on the question. The era also produced the CB radio craze, which is one of the most thoroughly documented American fads in history, partly because the people caught up in it talked about it constantly and at length on the radio. Citizens Band Radio had been allocated for private use by the Federal Communications Commission since 1958 and had for 15 years served mainly as a practical communication tool for long-haul truck drivers who used it to share information about road conditions, traffic, and the location of law enforcement across stretches of highway where no other communication was available. In 1973, the oil crisis produced fuel rationing and a national 55 miles per hour speed limit. Truckers, who could not operate economically at 55 miles per hour without severely disrupting their schedules and income, used their CB radios to coordinate, alerting each other to speed traps, tracking fuel availability, organizing informal highway convoys. It was, in their context, a genuinely practical tool for navigating an impractical situation. The country became aware of this through a country music song called Convoy, released in 1975 by a musician working under the name C.W. McCall, which narrated a trucker convoy in the CB's distinctive vocabulary. The song reached #1 on both the country and pop charts, which is a kind of chart performance that tells you something significant has connected, and then everyone wanted a CB radio. By 1977, CB radio sales in the United States had reached approximately 11 million units per year. Not truckers, suburban homeowners, teenagers, retirees, professionals with no particular reason to monitor highway conditions or evade speed enforcement, but who found the CB radio appealing for reasons that had more to do with community than communication. You chose a handle, a radio nickname, often elaborate, and you talked to strangers. Your handle might be Rubber Duck or Nighthawk or Sweet Peach, or something involving a regional animal. The CB created an anonymous social network with its own vocabulary, customs, and a warmth that surprised people who had not expected to feel it. The vocabulary entered everyday speech. 10-4 for understood. Good buddy for fellow CB operator. What's your 20 for where are you located? Smokies for state highway patrol. Bear in the air for a police helicopter. Plain wrapper for an unmarked police car. The CB had developed organically something approaching its own dialect. A poetic shorthand built by working people with practical needs and a certain fondness for color. The craze ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. By 1979, CB radio use had collapsed to a fraction of its peak. The FCC expanded the available channels, inadvertently destroying the intimacy that had made the original frequencies feel like a community, and fads, by their constitutional nature, eventually exhaust the energy that sustains them. The CB radios went into closets and garages alongside the fondue sets and the macrame projects and the other artifacts of the 1970s that had seemed absolutely necessary in the moment and merely peculiar in subsequent decades. The fondue set is worth a brief pause. In the 1970s, owning a fondue set was a dinner party statement of genuine cultural significance. Having one meant you were the kind of person who was familiar with European dining customs and had brought them into your home in a spirit of cosmopolitan sophistication. The fondue itself, warm melted cheese into which you dip bread on long forks in a social context, was, in the fondue set's golden years, considered meaningfully more interesting than a casserole. Whether it was actually more interesting than a casserole is a question with a subjective answer. What is not subjective is that a large number of fondue sets purchased in the early 1970s saw between 2 and 4 dinner parties before becoming garage sale items in the early 1980s. The decade also briefly produced streaking. Running through public spaces without clothing was practiced at sporting events, university campuses, and at least one notable Hollywood award ceremony, during which a man named Robert Opal jogged across the stage behind presenter David Niven at the Academy Awards in 1974 and made a peace sign. Niven's response, delivered without pause into microphone to a live audience of millions, was among the more precisely calibrated pieces of unscripted deadpan the decade produced. He observed that this was most likely the only laugh a gentleman would ever receive by removing his clothing and displaying what Niven described with magnificent composure as his shortcomings. Streaking as a fad lasted briefly, perhaps because, unlike the CB radio or the pet rock, it could not be commodified. You could not sell it, only do it, and the audience's attention was finite in a way that the participants had not necessarily calculated in advance. What is easy to miss about the 1970s, looking back from a distance of decades, is that underneath all the fondue and the pet rocks and the mood rings, something real was happening. The decade was genuinely searching. It was processing the disillusionment of the late 60s, the economic stress of inflation and oil shocks, the loss of certain confident certainties about America and its institutions. The objects were strange, but the impulse behind them, the desire to connect, to laugh at something together, to possess something that felt like a small piece of clarity in a confusing decade, was perfectly human and entirely recognizable. Then the 1980s arrived, and they brought a different kind of energy. Where the 70s had been searching, the 80s were insisting. Where the 70s had been collectively weird, the 80s were individually ambitious. And in the area of physical self-improvement, the decade produced a revolution, whose visual aesthetic has faded into comedy, but whose practical impact outlasted the leg warmers by a considerable margin. Jane Fonda's workout tape, released in 1982, sold more than 17 million copies. At that point, the best-selling home video in history. The tape showed Fonda in a high-cut leotard leading viewers through a sustained aerobics routine to an energetic soundtrack. Her instruction style was warm but demanding, the manner of someone who genuinely believed in what she was doing and thought you could do it properly if you tried. The tape was enormously influential, not just commercially but culturally. It established the idea that exercise instruction could be a consumer product, could be brought into the living room, could be done by ordinary people in their own homes on their own schedule, without requiring a gym membership or a team or any particular athletic background. The running boom that preceded had been building through the late 1970s, beginning in earnest with the publication of Jim Fixx's The Complete Book of Running in 1977. Fixx's book made running, previously associated primarily with competitive athletes and people being chased, into a mainstream leisure activity practiced by millions of ordinary Americans for its own sake, in its own time, for their own health. People who had not run since childhood began running. People who were overweight began running. Older people began running. The sneaker industry, which had been producing athletic shoes primarily for athletes, realized with some urgency that its customer base had expanded by several orders of magnitude and responded to extensive product development. Jim Fixx died a heart attack while running in 1984. The anti-exercise faction found this rhetorically useful and has not entirely stopped mentioning it in the 40 years since, though exercise physiologists have consistently noted that Fixx had significant coronary artery disease diagnosed well before his book was published, and that his running had almost certainly extended his life substantially beyond what sedentary years would have allowed. The aerobics craze that Fonda's tape embodied required several things to happen simultaneously, and in the early 1980s they did. The availability of home video players at prices ordinary households could afford. The rise of synthesizer-driven pop music that provided a reliable, steady beat without the complications of live musicians. A fashion industry that had created a complete vocabulary of athletic clothing. Leotards in every color, leg warmers in multiple lengths and weights. Headbands, spandex, bicycle shorts with visible seams, which communicated participation in fitness culture as a kind of identity before you even started moving, and a broadly shared cultural concern about health, weight, and physical appearance that was more available, more discussed, and more commercially exploited in the 1980s than it had been in any previous decade. Aerobic studios opened in every American city of any size. Jazzercise, the system developed by Judy Shepard Missett in the 1960s and franchised extensively through the 70s and 80s, had more than 3,000 franchise locations by 1983. Richard Simmons built a media presence on the proposition that exercise could be genuinely fun, inclusive, and emotionally supportive rather than punishing or exclusive. He found a large, enthusiastic, and genuinely grateful audience. The exercise video market expanded to accommodate every conceivable approach. There were gentle programs for older adults. There were programs of near military intensity for people who believed insufficient suffering indicated insufficient commitment. There were programs combining aerobics with dance, with martial arts forms, with various other movement traditions. There were videos featuring celebrities, athletes, actors, musicians, all of whom had developed strong opinions about fitness and the willingness to share them while in motion on camera. Leg warmers, which had originated as functional garments for dancers and ballet students who needed to keep their muscles warm between training sessions, became one of the decade's most recognizable fashion statements, worn not only in studios but in everyday life, pulled over jeans, paired with skirts, sometimes worn in multiple colors stacked on the same leg in a layering technique that made complete sense in 1983 and looks, from a vantage of 40 years later, like it, must have seemed like a better idea than it does now. The leg warmer's journey from the ballet bar to the suburban shopping mall is one of those clothing migrations that fashion history records without fully explaining. The fitness culture of the 1980s, unlike some of its predecessors in this evening's story, did not entirely disappear when the decade ended. It transformed. The specific visual forms, the synthesizer soundtrack, the leotard, the headband, the particular earnest intensity of the aerobic studio, pass into either nostalgia or gentle mockery, but the underlying conviction that regular physical exercise was a good idea and that technology could help ordinary people pursue it in organized ways, that conviction stayed. The decade of the neon workout cassette produced, in its own somewhat inadvertent way, a permanent shift in how Americans related to their bodies and what could be reasonably expected from them through voluntary effort. What followed the aerobics era in the 1990s was not a further evolution of self-improvement. It was an emergence of something older and more elemental, the impulse to collect, to acquire, to possess and to invest and to speculate and argue at great length about whether what you were possessing was worth what you were paying, whether it would be worth more later, whether mint condition mattered, whether the tag mattered, whether taking out of the original packaging would destroy the value, or whether the value was already speculative enough that the box made no difference. It was the era of the Beanie Baby, and nothing before or after it has quite produced a particular variety of collective self-deception that it generated. Picture a Tuesday afternoon in 1998 in a gift shop in Charlotte or Sacramento or Cincinnati. The shop is the kind of place that sells scented candles and greeting cards and small decorative items. In the front display, filling several shelves, are small plush animals. Each is perhaps 8 inches tall. Each has a name tag with a name, a birthday, and a brief poem. They are soft. They have small plastic eyes. They are filled with PVC pellets that the company's marketing materials call beans. These are Thai Beanie Babies. They are also, if the conversation you happen to overhear between two women examining the display is representative of a national conversation, an investment strategy. One is explaining to the other, with the calm patience of someone sharing genuinely valuable information, that specific retired Beanie Babies, animals that the manufacturer, Thai Incorporated, has stopped producing, are selling on the internet auction site eBay for hundreds of dollars, some for considerably more. A first edition Princess the Bear, a purple bear with a white rose produced in memorial to Princess Diana, had been documented selling for upward of $500 in mint condition. Condition was critical. The tag must be intact, unbent, uncrinkled. Some collectors used clear acrylic tag protectors. Some left the Beanie Babies in their shipping envelopes entirely. Display cases existed specifically designed for their storage. There were shelving systems. She has 463 Beanie Babies. She is tracking the secondary market on a website. She has a spreadsheet. Her husband had reservations initially, but has become supportive since she demonstrated that they have already profited substantially on secondary market sales of previously purchased animals. This was not an unusual conversation to have in 1998. Beanie Baby collecting was a documented economic phenomenon analyzed in newspapers and business publications with complete seriousness. People bought Beanie Babies. People sold them. People speculated on which animals might be retired next, because Thai's practice of retiring, discontinuing specific animals caused their secondary market prices to spike. There were price guide books. There were investment newsletters. There were conventions and hotel ballrooms where collectors examined each other's inventory for tag integrity. Ty Warner had founded Thai Incorporated in 1986 and had produced plush toys with moderate success until the Beanie Baby launch in 1993. The toys were priced at $5, making them accessible to almost everyone. They were sold through small specialty retailers rather than major chains, which created a sense of limited availability. The retirement practice, phasing out specific animals and introducing new ones, which was an ordinary business decision about product rotation, turned out to be extraordinarily effective at generating secondary market enthusiasm because it transformed every animal from a toy into a potential future collectible. Warner understood something, intuitively or by design, that the pet rock had demonstrated 20 years earlier and that every subsequent collectible market has confirmed. Manufacturer scarcity transforms commodity into something different. A $5 plush animal is a toy. The same animal, retired, is an asset. The transition is accomplished entirely by the act of discontinuing production. Whether the asset retains value depends entirely on whether sufficient numbers of people continue to believe it will, which is true of all assets, and is not the kind of thing one tends to examine carefully while standing in front of a gift shop display holding a small purple bear. The Beanie Baby market collapsed, substantially if not entirely, around the year 2000. Thai retired far more animals than the market had anticipated. flooding the secondary market and disrupting the scarcity that had supported prices. The economic enthusiasm of the late 1990s, which had created unusually favorable conditions for speculative behavior across multiple markets simultaneously, began to correct. And something happened in Beanie Baby households across the country that is difficult to characterize precisely: a gradual, quiet awakening, in which people who have been maintaining temperature-controlled storage for their collections and checking eBay listings before breakfast looked at what they had built and had a complicated internal conversation. The thrift stores and yard sales of the early 2000s filled with small, soft animals priced at 25 cents and 50 cents, their tags in various states of condition, their plastic eyes maintaining the same mild, pleasant expression they had worn throughout the boom years. They had never quite understood what was expected of them. They were toys. They had been toys the whole time. The decade had other enthusiasms alongside the Beanie Babies. The Tamagotchi, a small Japanese electronic device designed to be worn on a keychain, which simulated a digital pet requiring regular feeding, cleaning, and interaction, sold millions of units in 1996 and 1997 and was eventually banned from many American schools because students could not stop checking on their virtual companions during classroom hours. The death of a Tamagotchi, which occurred the owner failed to attend to it for too long, produced responses in its owners that developmental psychologists found genuinely interesting to observe. Responses that engaged the same emotional circuits that real losses engage, in a way that was novel and not entirely anticipated. Pogs, small circular discs originally made from milk bottle caps, used in a tabletop game that swept American elementary schools in the mid-90s, generated a secondary market, dedicated retailers, and eventual bans from certain school districts on the grounds that the competitive dynamics involved something too close to gambling for an educational setting. This was the same concern that marbles had generated in the 1930s and trading cards in the 1980s, and it will almost certainly generate itself again in some future decade with some future object, because the impulse is old and the objects are new, but the dynamic between them does not change. All of this, the Beanie Babies and the Tamagotchis and the Pogs and the general speculative energy of the late 90s, moved toward the end of the decade. And as it moved, something began to accumulate at the end of it. A question that a specific subset of the population had been raising for years in computer science journals and corporate IT departments and government technical committees, that the rest of the population was now becoming urgently aware of as the calendar turned toward an unprecedented number. What happened when the year 2000 arrived? You are in a suburban garage in the fall of 1999. The shelves have been reorganized over the past several months. Where tools and sports equipment used to live, there are now boxes. They hold water, dozens of gallon jugs, stacked in organized rows. They hold canned goods, beans, vegetables, soups, fruit, things that store for years without requiring refrigeration or electricity. There's a hand-cranked emergency radio on one shelf, a first aid kit on another, a portable generator in the corner, which your husband spent 3 weekends learning to operate properly and safely, fuel for the generator, stored according to all relevant guidelines. A small safe contains paper money, cash, the kind you can use if electronic systems fail. The reasoning, which you've been over together many evenings, is this: computer systems around the world might fail when the year 2000 arrives because of a software problem that has been accumulating for decades. Banks might not function. ATMs almost certainly would not work. Power grids might be affected. Water treatment might be disrupted. The digital infrastructure on which modern life had quietly come to depend might fail in ways that nobody could predict with certainty. And if it failed, paper cash and canned food and clean water and a way to generate your own power would matter enormously. The Y2K bug, formerly the year 2000 problem, had a technical basis that was entirely real. Many computer programs written from the 1960s through the 1980s stored years as 2 digits rather than 4, because in the era of expensive memory, the 2 digits a century were considered reliably redundant. 1978 was stored as 78. This was fine when every year reliably began with 19. When the year 2000 arrived, a program reading the year as 00 had to make a decision. Was this the year 2000 or the year 1900? What did the system do with that ambiguity? Did it crash? Produce incorrect calculations? generate cascading errors in the financial, medical, and infrastructure systems that ran on software decades old? The honest answer in 1999 was that nobody was entirely certain, and that the systems potentially affected power distribution networks, banking infrastructure, hospital equipment, water treatment controls, air traffic management systems were of a nature that even a small percentage failing in unpredictable ways could have significant real-world consequences. Governments, utilities, banks, and corporations spent the entirety of the late 1990s reviewing, updating, and testing their software. The cost of Y2K remediation in the United States has been estimated at between $100 and $300 billion. Programmers worked through the final year of the century in rotating shifts, reviewing code, fixing date-handling logic, testing results. The work was exhausting, unglamorous, and largely invisible to the general public, which, combined with the inherent invisibility of software, made it easy to underestimate how much was being done and how much it mattered. In the civilian world, the preparations varied dramatically. At the entirely sensible end, a few weeks of extra food and water, some cash on hand, a working flashlight. At the other end, people had liquidated retirement accounts and moved to rural properties. Some had purchased weapons. Some had developed elaborate theories about who was responsible for the situation. Theories that reflected certain familiar tendencies in how some Americans respond to the possibility of a large systemic disruption, less with engineering and more with lists of personal enemies. Midnight on the 31st of December, 1999, arrived. In Times Square, 1 million people watched the ball descend. In living rooms, families held hands. In garages, the canned goods sat in their organized rows. The power grids did not fail. The banks remained open. The water continued to run. The planes stayed in the air. There were minor date-handling errors in various peripheral systems. Some equipment displayed incorrect dates. Some logging systems produced anomalies, but the catastrophic infrastructure failure that some had anticipated did not materialize. The reason it did not materialize is almost certainly because the remediation work had been thorough, extensive, and effective, because the programmers who had worked through the final year of the century had actually fixed what needed to be fixed. But the timing created a particular interpretive challenge. It is very difficult to point to a disaster that did not happen and explain why it didn't happen, without reference to the enormous effort that prevented it. In the absence of visible catastrophe, some people concluded that the whole concern had been overblown. In the absence of a visible catastrophe, the people who had done the work that prevented it received relatively little acknowledgement. The garage shelves were quietly restocked over the following weeks and months with the ordinary things that garages hold. The generator went into the corner. The first aid kit stayed, because a first aid kit is always a reasonable thing to have. The 50 gallons of water were used gradually and not replaced in quite the same quantities. The paper money went back into bank, which turned out to be fine. The Y2K moment has become, in common memory, a shorthand for overreaction, for collective anxious silliness from a population that was frightened of a problem that wasn't real. This isn't quite fair. The threat was real enough that taking it seriously was entirely reasonable. The preparedness measures were, in many of their practical forms, genuinely sensible emergency planning. The water and food and cash were good ideas independent of any specific anticipated crisis. What the Y2K preparations really show, what they share with every other story we have moved through tonight, is a consistent human response to uncertainty, which is to do something, to act, to prepare, to build something or collect something or organize something or drink something or eat something or sit somewhere elevated and wave. Because doing something in the face of uncertainty feels more bearable than sitting with the uncertainty and doing nothing. The 20th century gave Americans an extraordinary amount to be uncertain about. It moved from horses to moon landings in 66 years. It moved from crystal radios in 1920 to a man walking on the moon in 1969. Every generation of it woke up in a world that looked measurably different from the one they had gone to sleep in, and every generation found its ways of responding, some brilliant, some peculiar, some both at once, and almost all of them, when you hold them close enough to see them clearly, entirely human. The people who drank radium water were not idiots. They were people who trusted the science of their day and were betrayed by how incomplete it was. The families who entered fitter family contests were not monsters. They were people who trusted the institutions and experts of their day and were betrayed by how badly those institutions could be wrong. The people who built bomb shelters were parents who loved their children and were doing the only thing they could think of to protect them from something they could not control. The people who bought pet rocks were, perhaps, simply people who wanted something that asked nothing of them in a decade that had asked rather a lot. The people who stacked canned goods in their garages at the end of the century were people who had paid attention and were not certain enough to do nothing, which is a position with more dignity than the subsequent narrative gives it. None of them were wrong to try. All of them were human. In most cases, those two facts are the same fact. And here is where the night finally catches up with all of us. We have traveled quite a distance tonight. We moved from a small brown bottle of radium water to a drugstore counter full of cocaine toothache drops, from the vibrating chairs of the Battle Creek Sanitarium to the chewing-focused discipline of Fletcherism, from couples dancing through weeks of exhaustion to speakeasies lit against the dark, from fairground tents ranking families by their genes to Harvard students swallowing goldfish on a dare. We watch women pencil seam lines on their bare legs and men sit on flagpoles in the rain. We ate our first TV dinner in front of a television set and built a bomb shelter in the backyard. We got on the CB radio and said 10-4 to strangers and meant it warmly. We bought mood rings and pet rocks and fondue sets and leg warmers and Beanie Babies and generators. And we sat up on the last night of the 20th century with our paper money in a small safe and our water in rows and our hand crank radio on the shelf. And we waited, and the new century arrived without catastrophe. And we were quietly, collectively grateful. What connects all of it, the strange, the earnest, the misguided, the inventive, the absurd, is simpler than any individual chapter. In every decade of this century, in every craze and movement and bottle and dance floor, there are people who believe they were doing the right thing, who believe they had found something real, or something useful, or something that would help, who thought the rock had value, or the dance floor was survivable, or the shelter was necessary, or the chewing was the answer. History is not particularly gentle with the wrong answers. It preserves them with a kind of affectionate irony. The radium chocolate, the fitter family medal, the CB radio in the closet. But if you look carefully, you can see that the wrongness was almost always paired with something genuine, a real desire for health, a real longing for community, a real need to feel that the future was something you could face and manage, and on certain evenings, even make a little fun of. The 20th century moved very fast and asked a great deal of the people who lived through it. They responded as people always respond to being asked a great deal, with creativity and confusion and community and competition, and the occasional investment in a small soft animal they plan to retire on, and the whole complicated, imperfect, endlessly interesting business of being alive in a world that keeps changing while you are watching it. So let your eyes close now, if they have not already. Let the century settle gently around you, all its noise and color and peculiarity going soft and quiet. The way everything becomes quiet in a long evening when what happened is still there, but is no longer urgent. Somewhere, a dance floor is emptying. The band is packing its instruments. The last couple on the floor sways together in something that is not quite dancing anymore and not quite sleeping. It is a thing between them. Something specific to that particular hall, in that particular city, in that particular year, and it will not exist again in quite the same form. The flagpole above the city stands empty in the early morning light. The flagpole sitter climbed down sometime before dawn, and someone brought him a sandwich, and he stood on the ground and looked at it as if it had changed while he was away, which in some small and unmeasurable way it had. In a kitchen somewhere, a TV dinner is cooling in its aluminum tray, its compartments holding their separate things in orderly proximity. In a garage, canned goods wait on their shelves with the patience of objects that have no opinion about their own necessity. In a closet, a CB radio sits beside a box of Beanie Babies, which is beside a mood ring, which is beside a small gray rock in a cardboard box with ventilation holes punched in the sides, waiting. The rock does not mind how the story ends. It has seen a lot of centuries. Sleep well. We will see you in the next one.